May 1945, New Guinea. Australian soldiers capture a Japanese general who commanded an army responsible for thousands of deaths, and every expert says he'll kill himself within days, like 73% of captured Japanese officers before him. But one Australian commander makes a shocking decision that the entire Allied command calls crazy, weak, and dangerous. What this commander did next didn't just save 13,000 lives, it rewrote the rules of war forever and changed how Japan itself would be rebuilt after the bombs fell. But could respecting your enemy's honor actually work better than destroying it? The air felt like breathing hot soup in the jungle clearing at Wewak. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi stood there, his uniform torn and dirty, his sword still hanging at his side. Australian soldiers surrounded him with rifles pointed at his chest. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The commander of Japan's entire 18th Army, the man who led over 142,000 soldiers into this green hell, had just surrendered. But surrender was just the beginning of the problem. The real crisis wasn't about one general. It was about what happened next. Every single time the Allies captured a high-ranking Japanese officer during this war, the same terrible pattern played out. Within days, sometimes hours, these men would find a way to kill themselves. The numbers told a dark story. 73 out of every 100 captured Japanese officers chose death over the shame of capture. They would use hidden blades, broken glass, their own belts, anything they could find. The code of Bushido, the ancient warrior way, taught them that capture meant total disgrace. Death was the only path to restored honor. American intelligence officers had tried everything. They stripped prisoners of all possessions. They watched them every minute of every day. They asked questions in harsh voices, sometimes for days without rest. Nothing worked. The officers still found ways to die, and when they died, they took all their secrets with them. Information about troop locations, supply routes, hidden bases, all of it disappeared into silence. The conventional wisdom was clear and simple. Treat enemy commanders as dangerous criminals, break their spirit, extract what information you can before they escape through death. In New Guinea alone, the numbers were staggering and brutal. 142,000 Japanese soldiers had died in the thick jungle. Disease killed more than bullets. Starvation killed more than bombs. The island had become a massive grave, and thousands of Japanese troops still hid in the jungle, cut off from supplies, slowly starving, but still fighting. Every day, 40 to 60 men died on both sides in small, savage firefights that accomplished nothing except adding more bodies to the count. Enter Major General Horace Robertson, 53 years old, weathered face, quiet voice, unexpected background. Robertson wasn't your typical military commander. His father was a Presbyterian minister who taught that every human soul had worth, even enemy souls. Before Robertson became a soldier, he studied the human mind and how people think. He understood something most generals didn't care about. Breaking a man's spirit might feel like victory, but it rarely produced cooperation. Fear made people silent. Respect made them talk. When Adachi was captured alive, Robertson saw something others missed. This wasn't just another Japanese officer. This was the commander of an entire army. Adachi knew where every hidden unit was located. He knew which soldiers still fought and which had given up. He knew where the ammunition was buried, where the field hospitals hid, where the supply caches remained. One man held the keys to ending the bloodshed, but only if that man chose to share what he knew. Robertson proposed something that sounded insane to every other officer who heard it. He wanted to treat Adachi with dignity. He wanted to address him by his rank. He wanted to let him keep his sword, the ultimate symbol of a samurai's honor. He wanted to give Adachi officer quarters instead of throwing him in a cage like an animal. He wanted to serve him tea and let him read Japanese books and allow him to write letters. The response from American and British intelligence officers was swift and brutal. They called Robertson soft. They called him naive. They called him a fool who didn't understand the enemy. One American colonel sent a message that said treating Adachi with kindness was not just stupid, it was strategically dangerous. These were the enemy, not guests at a garden party. The enemy needed to be broken, squeezed for information, then locked away until the war ended. Anything else was weakness that would cost Allied lives. But Robertson had studied the pattern. Harsh treatment produced dead officers and no intelligence, every single time. Among those who died, exactly 0 provided useful information. The current system had a 100% failure rate when it came to cooperation. You cannot do worse than 0. Any different approach, even a crazy sounding one, had to be better than the guaranteed failure of the old way. Robertson also understood something deeper about the code of Bushido. The code didn't just demand death after capture, it demanded death to avoid dishonor. But what if capture didn't mean dishonor? What if an enemy who treated you as a warrior, as an equal, as a man of rank deserving respect, removed the shame? What if the path to honor wasn't death, but cooperation to save the lives of men still under your command? The general looked at Adachi, standing in that jungle clearing surrounded by young Australian soldiers who had fought for years in the worst conditions imaginable. These soldiers wanted revenge. They wanted to see this enemy commander humiliated. Their friends had died by the thousands. The temptation to give them what they wanted, to throw Adachi into a dark cell and let nature take its course, was powerful. It would be easy. It would be popular. It would feel like justice. But Robertson made a different choice. He decided to gamble everything on a simple idea. Your enemy's honor code can be your greatest weapon if you respect it instead of trying to destroy it. He would treat Adachi not as a criminal, but as a fellow officer who had fought hard and lost. He would give Adachi something no other captured Japanese general had received, a reason to stay alive. The order went out on May 15th, just days after the capture. Adachi would be addressed as general. He would keep his ceremonial sword. He would have private quarters. He would receive the same food as Australian officers. He would be allowed to maintain his dignity. Every expert said this would fail. Every conventional approach said this was wrong. Robertson didn't care what the experts said. He cared about the 13,000 Japanese soldiers still hiding in the jungle, still fighting, still dying for no reason except that no one had given them permission to stop. The protocol started immediately, and it was specific down to the smallest detail. Every morning at 8 o'clock sharp, Robertson would meet with Adachi, not for interrogation, but for conversation. Tea would be served, proper Japanese tea when they could find it, regular tea when they couldn't. Adachi could read books in Japanese that had been captured from enemy supplies. He could write letters, though they would be read before sending. Most importantly, Australian guards were ordered to salute him. A salute, that simple gesture of military respect, carried enormous weight. The first 72 hours would tell the story. In that short time, something remarkable happened. Adachi began to talk, not because anyone forced him, not because anyone threatened him, but because Robertson had given him something unexpected, a reason to believe his life still had purpose. On the third day, Adachi provided information about 13,000 Japanese troops still scattered through the jungle. He drew maps from memory, marking positions with careful detail. He listed the names of officers still in command. He described which units still had food and which were starving. Within the first week, the intelligence was stunning. Adachi revealed the locations of 47 ammunition caches hidden throughout the jungle. These were supplies the Australians had searched for but never found. He identified 23 field hospitals, most of them just small clearings where wounded men lay on the ground with minimal medical care. The information was precise, detailed, and completely voluntary. Adachi wasn't being forced to betray his men. He was being given the opportunity to save them, but not everyone was happy. On May the 18th, just days after the new protocol began, a formal protest arrived from General MacArthur's headquarters. The message was clear and angry. Standard interrogation procedures must be followed. Treating enemy commanders with respect was unprecedented and inappropriate. The protest demanded that Adachi be moved to a standard prisoner facility and questioned using approved methods. The implication was obvious. Robertson was going soft on the enemy, and it needed to stop. Robertson had one crucial ally who made all the difference. General Thomas Blamey, the commander of Allied land forces, reviewed the intelligence gains from the first week and made a simple calculation. Robertson's approach had produced more useful information in 7 days than months of traditional interrogation had produced across the entire Pacific Theater. Blamey sent his own message back to MacArthur's headquarters. The message said that results matter more than methods, and the results here were impossible to argue with. The real test came in June. Robertson proposed something even more radical than treating Adachi with respect. He wanted to put Adachi on the radio, not to broadcast Allied propaganda written by someone else, but to let Adachi speak in his own words to the Japanese soldiers still fighting in the jungle. The idea was to let Adachi tell his men that the war was ending, that further fighting served no purpose, that surrender with honor was now possible. The technical challenges were significant. The Australian forces in New Guinea had only 3 working radio transmitters strong enough to broadcast across the jungle. Radio equipment in the tropical heat broke down constantly. Humidity destroyed circuits. Insects built nests inside machines. Power was limited and unreliable. But Robertson made it work because the potential payoff was enormous. If Adachi's voice could reach even a fraction of the 13,000 Japanese soldiers estimated to still be in the region, lives could be saved. The first broadcast happened on June 7th. Adachi sat in front of a microphone, wearing his full uniform, which Australian soldiers had cleaned and pressed for him. He held a piece of paper with notes he had written himself. No one told him what to say. Robertson believed that Adachi's own words, speaking soldier to soldier, would carry more weight than any script. Adachi's voice crackled across the airwaves. He spoke of honor and duty. He spoke of the changing war situation. He spoke of the responsibility every commander has to preserve the lives of his men when further fighting serves no strategic purpose. He did not beg. He did not plead. He spoke as a general to his soldiers, and that made all the difference. The response took time, but it came. Small groups of Japanese soldiers began emerging from the jungle. They came slowly, carefully, expecting to be shot or captured and abused. Instead, they found Australian soldiers who treated them with the same respect Adachi had received. Word spread through the jungle networks. The general had surrendered. The general was alive. The general was treated well. The general said surrender was honorable. By early July, the trickle became a flow. Groups of 10, then 20, then 50 Japanese soldiers came out of hiding. They were sick, starving, injured, but alive. The firefights that had claimed dozens of lives daily began to decrease. Some days passed with no combat at all. Australian medical teams treated Japanese wounded alongside their own. Food was shared. The killing was stopping. Robertson's gamble was working, but it required constant effort. Every surrendered soldier needed food, medical care, and shelter. Resources were limited. Some Australian soldiers questioned why they should share rations with men who had been trying to kill them days before. Robertson had to explain again and again that treating surrendered enemies well made more enemies surrender, which saved Australian lives. It was practical strategy, not soft-hearted charity. The innovation wasn't just in respect. It was in understanding that limited resources could be multiplied through human psychology. 3 radio transmitters reached 18,000 soldiers. One well-treated general influenced thousands of decisions. Small gestures of dignity, salutes, and clean uniforms and proper tea created ripples that spread far beyond what any amount of force could achieve. By August, the numbers told an undeniable story. 8,200 Japanese soldiers had surrendered peacefully, not captured after bloody fighting, but walked out of the jungle and laid down their weapons voluntarily. In a war where Japanese soldiers fought to the death as a matter of honor, this was unheard of. The suicide rate among these surrendered soldiers was nearly 0. The cooperation rate was over 90%. Robertson's approach wasn't just more humane, it was more effective in every measurable way. The numbers before and after Robertson's approach told a story that was impossible to ignore. In May, before Adachi's cooperation began, the daily combat deaths averaged between 40 and 60 men on both sides. Firefights erupted every single day as Australian patrols encountered hidden Japanese positions. The Japanese soldiers fought with desperate fury because they believed capture meant torture and death. The Australians fought with equal determination because every hidden enemy was a threat. The math was brutal and simple. 60 deaths per day, 30 days per month, meant 1,800 lives lost every single month to fighting that accomplished nothing strategic. By July, after just 2 months of Robertson's new approach, the transformation was dramatic. Daily combat deaths had dropped to single digits. Some days saw 0 combat. The reason was clear. 8,200 Japanese soldiers had surrendered peacefully. These men walked out of the jungle, laid down their weapons, and accepted Australian custody because they had heard Adachi's broadcasts and seen other soldiers treated well. The survival rate was 92%. In a war where military planners expected only 15% of isolated Japanese troops to survive, this was revolutionary. The scale of implementation grew rapidly. By August, the number of peaceful surrenders reached 13,400 soldiers. These weren't just individual fighters. These were entire units, sometimes led by their officers, who made the collective decision to stop fighting. The contrast with other Pacific operations was stark and undeniable. In the Philippines, where American forces used traditional harsh interrogation methods, the officer suicide rate remained at 89%. Almost 9 out of every 10 captured Japanese officers found ways to kill themselves. The intelligence value was minimal because dead men tell no secrets. But opposition to Robertson's methods was fierce and came from the highest levels. War crimes tribunal officials were preparing cases against Japanese commanders for atrocities committed during the war. They had evidence of terrible crimes. In 1943, Japanese forces under Adachi's command had massacred civilians in Wewak. The estimates said 200 innocent people had been killed. These officials saw Robertson's respectful treatment of Adachi as a betrayal of justice. How could a man responsible for such horror be given tea and salutes and comfortable quarters? The pressure on Robertson was intense. Messages arrived daily demanding that Adachi be handed over for immediate trial. Legal experts argued that treating war criminals with dignity sent the wrong message to both the Japanese and to victims of Japanese atrocities. The moral weight of those arguments was heavy. 200 civilians had died. Someone needed to answer for that. Justice demanded accountability, not tea ceremonies. Robertson's response was pragmatic but difficult to hear. He didn't deny Adachi's responsibility for crimes. He didn't argue that atrocities should be forgotten or forgiven. He argued that his job right now, in the middle of an ongoing conflict, was to save lives. 13,000 Japanese soldiers were still out there. Every day those men remained in the jungle meant more death. If treating Adachi well saved even 100 Australian lives by encouraging faster surrender, wasn't that worth delaying justice by a few months? The alternative approaches being used elsewhere provided stark evidence. In regions where captured Japanese officers faced immediate harsh treatment, the suicide rate remained catastrophically high. More importantly, the soldiers under those officers' commands kept fighting. They kept dying. They kept killing. The traditional approach of breaking enemy commanders produced a vicious cycle. Harsh treatment led to suicide. Suicide meant no communication with remaining troops, and no communication meant endless fighting. Robertson had broken that cycle. On July 15, 1945, Adachi wrote in his personal diary. The entry would later become famous. He wrote that he had been treated as a soldier, not as a beast. He wrote that this honor demanded he prevent further useless death. The words revealed the psychology Robertson had understood from the beginning. Adachi didn't cooperate because he was afraid. He cooperated because cooperation was now the honorable path. Robertson had changed the definition of honor from dying well to saving lives. The scenes of surrender were powerful and strange. In the humid New Guinea air, thick with moisture and the smell of rotting vegetation, groups of Japanese soldiers would emerge from the tree line. They would be thin, sick, their uniforms hanging loose on starved bodies. Australian soldiers would approach with weapons, ready, never sure if this was genuine surrender or a trap. The Japanese would bow, the Australians would gesture for them to put down their weapons. And then something unexpected would happen. Australian officers would salute. That salute, that simple gesture, made hardened soldiers on both sides weep. Men who had fought for years, who had seen friends die, who had killed enemies up close, found themselves crying at the recognition that the war was ending, that they might actually survive, that perhaps their enemy was not a monster, but just another soldier who wanted to go home. The emotional weight of those moments was impossible to fake or manufacture. It was real human connection breaking through years of hatred. The unexpected consequences kept multiplying. Surrendered Japanese soldiers, grateful for the respectful treatment, began volunteering to help. They knew the jungle better than any Australian. They knew where bodies might be found. They offered to guide recovery teams to locate the dead from both sides. Between July and September, these joint teams recovered 1,247 bodies. Australian families received remains they never thought they would see again. Japanese families, though far away, would eventually benefit from the same effort. The full scale of implementation became clear in September when Robertson compiled his report. The document ran 347 pages. It detailed every aspect of the approach, the specific protocols, the daily routines, the exact words used in radio broadcasts, the resource allocation, the medical treatment procedures, the psychological principles behind each decision. Robertson knew that if his approach worked here, it could work elsewhere. He knew that thousands of lives across the Pacific could be saved if others learned from what happened in New Guinea. The report recommended a complete overhaul of prisoner of war protocols. Stop treating captured enemies like animals to be broken. Start treating them like soldiers who had fought and lost. The difference in outcomes was measurable and massive. 92% survival rate versus 15%. Voluntary cooperation versus forced interrogation. Rapid surrender versus endless fighting. The numbers didn't lie. Respect worked better than brutality in every single category that mattered. But even as the evidence mounted, resistance remained. Critics pointed out that nice treatment didn't change the fact that war crimes had been committed. They argued that letting Adachi keep his sword was symbolic victory for a man who had led armies that committed atrocities. They worried that other Japanese commanders would see this as weakness and exploit it. The fear was real. What if being nice to the enemy encouraged more resistance by showing that capture wasn't so bad? Robertson's answer was always the same. Look at the results. Before this approach, 73% of officers died and 0% cooperated. After this approach, near 0% died and 90% cooperated. Before this approach, 60 soldiers died daily. After this approach, some days had 0 deaths. The results spoke louder than theories about what might happen. What did happen was lives saved, fighting stopped, and families reunited. The story of what happened in New Guinea in 1945 didn't end when the fighting stopped. The ideas Robertson proved in those humid jungles would travel far beyond the Pacific theater and reshape how the world thought about prisoners of war. In 1949, just 4 years after Adachi's surrender, the Geneva Convention was updated with new rules about how prisoners must be treated. The language in those updates came directly from Robertson's 347-page report. Treating prisoners with dignity wasn't just morally right anymore, it was international law. The transformation into standard practice took years, but followed a clear path. Military academies began teaching Robertson's approach as a case study in effective intelligence gathering. The psychology he understood, that respect produces cooperation better than fear, became accepted. Wisdom. By the 1970s, every major military in the world had protocols based on the New Guinea experience. The questions shifted from whether to treat prisoners well to exactly how to implement that treatment in different situations. But the most immediate impact was on Japan itself. When the war ended in August 1945 after the atomic bombs fell, General Douglas MacArthur faced a huge challenge. He needed to occupy Japan and rebuild the country without triggering mass resistance or suicide. MacArthur studied what happened in New Guinea. He saw that Robertson's respect-based approach had worked where force would have failed. MacArthur decided to use similar tactics with Emperor Hirohito and the Japanese government. Instead of treating the emperor as a war criminal to be humiliated, MacArthur treated him with respect while requiring cooperation. Instead of destroying Japanese culture, MacArthur worked within it. The approach wasn't identical to Robertson's, but the core principle was the same. Respecting your enemy's values can achieve more than crushing them. Japan's relatively peaceful transformation from enemy to ally in the years after the war owed something to lessons learned in the New Guinea jungle. Horace Robertson himself received surprisingly little recognition during his lifetime. He wasn't promoted to higher command. He didn't receive major medals for the New Guinea operation. When he died in 1960, his obituary focused on his general military service without highlighting the revolutionary approach to prisoner treatment. The lack of recognition wasn't necessarily unfair. Robertson had done his job well, but military honors often go to commanders who win battles, not those who prevent them. But Robertson's influence grew after his death. In 1986, the Australian Defence Force Academy made his report required reading for all officer candidates. Students studied the New Guinea operation as an example of how understanding human psychology can be as powerful as understanding tactics and weapons. Young officers learned that the smartest military decision isn't always the most aggressive one. Sometimes the bravest choice is to try something completely different when the old ways clearly aren't working. The story's darkest chapter involves the man at the center of it all. General Hatazo Adachi cooperated fully with Australian forces. He helped save thousands of lives. He broadcast messages that ended fighting. He provided intelligence that prevented more death. But in 1947, 2 years after the war ended, he faced trial for war crimes committed by forces under his command. The charges included the Wewak massacres and other atrocities. The evidence was strong. 200 civilians had died. Adachi had been in command. On September 10, 1947, Adachi chose death. He committed seppuku, the traditional samurai suicide, rather than face execution by his captors. His final letter was addressed to Robertson. The words were simple but heavy with meaning. Adachi thanked Robertson for restoring his honor so that he might end it properly. The letter revealed the complexity of what had happened in New Guinea. Robertson had given Adachi a reason to live long enough to save others, but Adachi still believed that death was the only proper end for a defeated commander. The tragedy of Adachi's suicide haunted Robertson's legacy. Critics pointed to it as proof that respecting the enemy's honor code just enabled them to escape justice. Supporters argued that without Robertson's approach, Adachi would have killed himself in May 1945, and 13,000 Japanese soldiers would have kept fighting and dying. Both views had truth. The moral mathematics of trading 2 years of cooperation for the eventual death of one man versus the immediate death of thousands was complicated and uncomfortable. The broader conclusion that emerged from studying the New Guinea operation was this: treating enemies as human beings rather than monsters can save lives even in war's darkest hours. This wasn't soft-hearted idealism. It was hard-headed strategy backed by undeniable numbers. 92% survival rate versus 15%, 13,000 surrenders versus endless fighting. The approach worked not because it was nice, but because it was effective. The modern relevance became clear decades later in different wars. In 2007, American forces in Iraq faced fierce resistance from insurgents. Traditional aggressive tactics weren't working. Then some commanders tried what became known as the Anbar Awakening. Instead of treating all Iraqis as potential enemies, they began working with tribal leaders, respecting local customs, building relationships. The approach directly referenced Robertson's work in New Guinea. Respect cultural honor codes and you get cooperation. Destroy them and you get endless resistance. The connection to present-day challenges extends beyond military operations. The principle applies anywhere humans face conflict, in business negotiations, in diplomatic relations, in community disputes. The same truth holds. Understanding and respecting the other side's values, even when you completely disagree with them, produces better outcomes than trying to force submission. This doesn't mean accepting wrong behavior. It means finding paths to change that work with human nature instead of against it. Current prisoner of war treatment protocols in 195 countries trace their origins to Robertson's work. The Geneva Convention rules about dignified treatment, about maintaining prisoners' sense of self-worth, about respecting cultural practices, all connect back to what happened in New Guinea. The specific words might have changed over decades of updates and revisions, but the core principle remained. Prisoners are still human beings, deserving basic dignity. The philosophical reflection that closes this story requires sitting with discomfort. In May 1945, a Presbyterian minister's son gambled that honor respected is stronger than honor destroyed. The evidence proved he was right. 13,000 men survived who would have died. Families were reunited. The killing stopped faster. By every practical measure, the approach succeeded brilliantly. But the cost of that wisdom, paid by both Adachi and the thousands who lived because of him, reminds us that history's greatest lessons come in the most complex shades of gray. Sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't defeating your enemy. It's remembering they're human. That simple truth, proven in a humid jungle over 80 years ago, challenges us still. When we face people we disagree with, people who have done wrong, people we have every reason to hate, what serves us better, breaking them or respecting the human dignity they still possess? The answer won't always be comfortable. It won't always feel like justice. But the bodies not buried in New Guinea, the families not destroyed, the soldiers who went home instead of dying in the jungle, they all testify to what happens when we choose the harder path of seeing enemies as people first.